this here today. This is a talk I gave at AU, and we wanted to extend it out to our larger customer base, and those just not those that were Autodesk University or had been part of that. And the idea is we're going to talk about managing these large Vault databases. So part of the reason I get to talk about managing large Vault databases is I've been doing this a while. I worked with Autodesk products probably since 1995. I had to step in the Wayback Machine when I was doing some of this. I'm like, when was that? So I know it was AutoCAD 12. I'm based here out of Toledo, Ohio, and I've been working with Imaginet for the past 22 years. Since then, Vault came out around 2004, and we've been implementing it 2004. So I've been working with it ever since. And I could not come up with hard and fast numbers, but it was hundreds of Vault projects that I've participated in, whether scoping them, delivering them, project managing them, whatever it may be. So I've done a lot of these. Part of the reason that I called this standing on the shoulders of giants was that some of this is hard-won experience, but I mentioned I had scoped and project managed some of these projects. We've got such a depth of experience here at Imaginet, and a lot of this information comes from working with people who have been dealing, with much larger vaults that I have, been working with these, and these were some of the things that stood out to them and stood out to me as beneficial. So what we're going to look at is the idea of taking a look at the best practices for purging vaults, taking a look at the benefits of backing up Vault databases. So not a standard Vault backup, but the idea of backing up the Vault databases. Methods for copying the file store. So there's a couple of ways that we can move this information around and work with this and all of these different ideas. So what we'll do is take a look at this. Before we get too deep into it though, I do want to talk about Vault sizes. And this is something that stands out to me. If you were to call me today, say, Caleb, we would like to upgrade our Vault. I'm going to guess, and it's just a guess, but I'm guessing your Vault is 600 gig. That seems to be just about the number I run into when I'm working with these clients. Is it's just, here you go. This is about where we're at. Maybe it's 500, maybe it's a little more, but somewhere in that range. And then as we move along the standard, standard deviation, we start to get into what I call a tiny Vault, which is 50 gig or smaller. Every now and again, I'll run into somebody who has an 8 gig Vault. And it's just like, wow, yeah, we can do that in 5 minutes. Then as it goes up the chain, we get up into the giant vaults. And, you're into the multiple terabytes, 1.5 terabytes or higher. We're getting into very large vaults. And at AU, I asked the question, how big, is anybody bigger than that? And we kind of kept going up. And there were several that were in the 7-8 gig range. Right? So 7 or 8 terabyte range, not just gig. The terabyte range, so large amounts of data, right, that we have, that we need to move around, that we need to back up, that we need to do all of these things with. But to give you a sense of that, typically right around 300 to 600 gig, you may not need to worry about any of this, right? It's easy enough to take the backups, there's enough space, we can move things around. All of that's capable in there, right? It's when we get into these really large ones that it gets much more difficult. So what do we do? Well, I put this together in the form of, I wanted to kind of think of it, the different ways that we can approach this and different things we can do. And we'll look at this as kind of a story. So the story is, you're responsible for defending a city. And reports have come back that a giant is approaching the city and you have to decide what to do. You have 3 options: freeze, defend, or attack. So you can, each one of these different options are some different strategies we have for working with these large vaults and large systems that we have in place. So let's take a look through these, and we'll take a look. So we're going to start out with chapter 1 here, and what if we did nothing? Sometimes that's the answer. Okay, it doesn't really mean not doing anything. It's just not a concern in and of itself. I have had clients call me and say, hey, I've got a vault and it's getting really big. We're closing in on 800 gig And so we've got a large vault, right? My question is always those basic things, is the vault functioning as expected? Yes, it is. Okay, cool. Is user experience acceptable? That seems to be fine. Great. You don't have to do anything, right? Realistically, this isn't a cause for concern in and of itself. There's nothing we have to do to change this. Vaults over time, we are creating data. We're creating, we're putting that in there. We're adding to the database by putting all the metadata in as part of this. It's going to grow over time. It just is. We would expect it to. That's a natural function of creating more designs and putting them in there. So if there's enough disk space, there is no limit on the size of a Vault file store database. Does not have to be. I'm assuming some things you're using full SQL and not SQL Express because there's a 10 gig limit on that. But with full SQL in place, if you've got enough disk space, you can just let it go. So we don't have to do anything. However, some things to think about, and this is how Vault size gets there. The file store is a function of the number of files in the Vault, the number of versions of those files, and the size of those files. So it's a function of number of files times average file size times average number of versions, right? So if I've got 10 things I'm tracking in Vault, and each one of them are 1 gig, great, it's 10 gig. It's an easy number. But then they have versions that are in there, and they have 10 versions. Now we're at 100 gig. That's how the file store size grows, is what do I have in Vault? Average file size, average number of versions. So a Vault database, it's a little different. It's the number of files and the number of properties associated to those files. So that's exactly where that comes in. It's the number of files times the number of properties. So I have had some clients, we go look at their Vault. I'm like, why is this database so tiny? And I realize we're not doing revisions. We're not tracking all of that. It's literally files with almost no properties on them. So the database stays smaller. I've got others where I'm like, this database seems big. And then we go look, there's a whole lot of properties we're tracking, maybe 100 per file. So all of those work together, right, to change how that works. Things that don't necessarily affect Vault size. One is the age of the Vault. Again, I've had some people who use a Vault as a repository. New files aren't necessarily being added. This is a historical Vault that I have, and I'm going to, view the files that are in it, but I'm not actively adding more. Great, no problem. That's pretty simple. So the age of the Vault doesn't matter. Number of users may not matter. If there's a lot of viewers, if people aren't, putting new files in, it's not going to matter too much. And then Vault Basic versus Vault Pro does not necessarily affect Vault size. Typically, an older Vault with a lot of users and its Vault Pro is going to be bigger than a new Vault with a small number of users that's Vault Basic. But I've learned, in my experience, I've seen some incredibly large Vault Basics, databases. So it's something to consider. The big thing that affects it, number of files, average file size, and average number of versions. So we could do nothing. However, there are things we can do. And when I came up with defend, it's our second thing we can do. It's the idea of building up the city walls, right? We want to build up the city walls to protect our city from the giant that's coming. So what this typically means for Vault administrators, a big one is purging the file store, managing the file store through purging old versions. The size of our file store is dependent on the number of versions. So that's something we have within there and can consider. Also, proper SQL architecture, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The idea of SQL maintenance, and then optimizing user experience. So as much as possible, these tasks should be automated. We can have scheduled tasks that kick off some of these things and put that in place. So purging old versions is one that I'll start with. And this is from, if you're in the Autodesk Data Management Server, if you're in the console, You pick the vault to be purged, you choose actions, you choose purge, and you select your options. Every time I check a file in, it creates a version and puts that in Vault. If I check the same file in 10 times, I get 10 versions. I may not need all of those versions, so I can control what I'm going to delete. Typically, the easiest way is to purge files based on revision and lifecycle rules. And if you're using Vault Pro, this will be your option. If you're using Vault Basic, you only have the option to do it by, excuse me, I'm gonna get my spotlight. We only have to do it with the old, the rules that we're giving it. Purge everything except the latest 5, purge everything that's 180 days old, or purge something where we have a specific comment, or exclude things where we have a specific comment. So purging removes those files. Purging can be set up to work as a scheduled task. So we can have a command line version of this and actually have that script there that you can go through and we'll purge this out. So you could have a scheduled task that every day runs and purges old items and keeps that limit low. So that's an option that's available as part of that. So that's one I would recommend as a scheduled task, is being able to get in and do that. But purging the old versions is going to keep our file store low. For the SQL side, we would want to make sure we've got SQL set up properly. So the one thing we can do is set the way that we've got it installed, and this version and SQL are installed on the same server. Okay? That is the simplest version, and that's probably of the vaults that are out there. Talk to a lot of clients, and SQL is on the same system. You can install SQL on a second server. So there's a Vault server and then a SQL server specifically. If you have a large number of users, if you have really large databases and a large user base, like 50 plus users, that might make sense and would help with the speed at which you the database is turning over. It's got a dedicated machine, so it's only working with that machine when it's doing those things. If you have a small number of users, if you've got 5 users, some people have where corporately SQL goes on its own server, that's fine. But a lot of times it doesn't make sense to maintain a separate server. It's not going to give you any benefit as far as Vault is concerned. Maybe it's a corporate mandate, that's fine. Maybe it's the way, everything else is set up this way. That's fine. I've done that. I've worked with clients for exactly those reasons. This is how we do it. Fair enough, let's go. But if we really look at it, there's no benefit to Vault for that. However, if you have over 50 users, if you have large databases, setting SQL up on a separate server could enhance performance. There's a SQL maintenance plan. And imagine it, when we install Vault, we typically set up a SQL maintenance plan that keeps database size smaller. It's going to delete log sizes. It's going to check data for integrity. Right? There's a standard one we set. If you Google it, there's a standard one out there. There was also, however, a 90-minute Autodesk class on just this. When I thought I was going to include more of it in my talk, and I'm like, oh, there's no way. I don't have time for half of it. But the idea of setting a SQL maintenance plan. So if you have installed Vault yourself, or it was been installed in the past, this is a good question to ask. Do you have a SQL maintenance plan in place? Is it running, right? This tends to keep the database smaller, keeps it more compact, makes it easier to search through. We can go and find that information. Again, these things can be scripted. And this is an example of a batch file that I have over to the right that would run through based off of a scheduled task. It would run off the batch file and it would push that information through. One other one I'm going to throw out, and I'll just point this out here. I just think this is kind of interesting. And this is one for the users. Everything else is so admin based, but I have run into this multiple times where if I have a folder that has 1,000 files in it, 2,000 files in it, I click on that folder and it says waiting for grid to display. And then you sit there and you sit there and it takes 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and then finally it shows up. And it just takes forever. So it was always kind of interesting to me because I would think that it would show up very quickly because most properties are held in the database and they should just show up. When I click on that, there's the properties, they just appear. However, there are some properties called runtime calculated properties. Okay? So there's our user properties, there's our system properties, and then runtime calculated properties. Runtime calculated properties are generated by taking a look at the files that are on your working folder in your hard drive and comparing it to the files in Vault. Vault status, the entity icon, there's Vault state, there's a couple of these that are specifically runtime calculated properties. So if you have 2,000 files in a Vault folder, this has to look through 2,000 files to see the difference. It's going to run through and look at that, and it won't generate it until it's checked them all. So you can remove those properties from the view. If you're clicking on something and that grid's taken forever to come up, you can remove those properties. Matter of fact, I just wrote a blog post. I just realized this. Yay. I just wrote a blog post on this a couple weeks ago about how to remove these. Generally, your best practice is not to have more than 2,000 files in a folder. Even at 2,000, this tends to take a while, but you can remove those properties. The weird part is no list exists for these properties. I went to say, which ones can I remove? What are they? And there's no list exists that I found. If they cannot be found in the advanced search tool, they are runtime calculated properties. Okay. And then you could just right click and remove them from the view. So just super quick, this is what I'm talking about. Oh my goodness, I've got so many different views now. Let's see here. Give me just a second. I'm gonna log out and log in. I'm gonna go to a different vault that I have in place here. So I've got different properties that are up here. What I'm talking about is if I go to my find, my advanced search, and I search, and I'm looking in here, for example, I've got a property called, I'll close it because I'm not gonna see it if I don't rest on it, entity icon. If I go here to my advanced find, I am not going to find entity icon in this list because it is a runtime generated property. It is not something for me to search on. It does not exist as part of this list. Comment does, state does, Vault status modifier. Well, let's go look for that one. Now, of course, I'm looking for it because I know it doesn't exist, but this will give you an idea. I can go down here. Nope, there is no property called Vault status modifier that I can search for. That means this one is generated at runtime. This one is generated at runtime. So is this one. There are 3 by default that are runtime generated properties in your standard view. You can just remove those columns and it will take them out of that view. Now, I have had some clients who say, gosh, but we use those. Well, that's, it's a trade-off, right? You could create a special custom view and switch back and forth to that. But that is a way that will speed up that search and being able to view that information by turning off those specific runtime properties. So we can do nothing. We can defend, and we can defend by setting our database, setting up our database so we've got specific maintenance routines. We can purge the files so we're keeping the file store smaller, or we can wrestle this growth giant. So what are we talking about here? So I am going to note several things. This is the line that I have there that starts with note. This is right from Autodesk's website. This is right from their help. Autodesk does not support any third-party software or methods to back up Vault data. The console, ADMS console backup and restore wizard is the supported disaster recovery solution for vaulted data. So We're entering interesting territory here. This is something that we ran into, we being Imaginet ran into as a company, where we're working with our clients and we're working with these different things, and all of a sudden we're getting into these really big databases. We're getting into really big file stores, and we need a way to manage this. So we figured some stuff out. And again, some of this isn't just me, this is obviously the extended team and just some different ideas that came into place. So I'm going to talk about these, but again, this is kind of proceed at your own risk, right? This is some different ideas that we have. So the concepts that we started using are actually built into Vault Professional 2024. Vault Professional 2024 has an option to back up the databases only. And it creates a backup folder with no file store. It also has a restore option for restoring and we can say use an existing file store. So we're going to point to which file store we want to use. Typically, the way that this works is it makes a backup of the databases and it makes a backup of the file store and throws them into a single folder. We have options here to do this separately. So effectively, we're uncoupling the databases from the file store. So why would we? I'll go to Robocopy in a minute, but why would we want to do this? So let's imagine I've got a 2 terabyte vault. And to run the backup takes me 24 hours. Then I need to copy that backup to the new server because we're going to upgrade. So I'm going to copy it to a new server. Just grinding through the copying process, maybe that's 12 hours, maybe it's 10. Then I need to restore it. So that's going to be 12 hours, 15 to restore it to that. By the time it migrates forward, maybe we're into 20. So even if running this overnight, I've got a minimum of 3, possibly 4 working days where I can't access my vault because we're limited to as soon as we take that backup, nobody else can add to or change anything in Vault until we've got this backup, until we've restored it and we're working with the new version. Another example would be I need to copy this to a new cloud server that we just got. So I need to take the file store and the backup and move everything up to the cloud server. I've had clients decide not to do cloud servers because of the amount of time this would take. So we'll talk about if we can decouple the file store and the databases. We can use this in a couple of different ways. So one quick thing, I'll just point this out super quick. Autodesk Data Management Server. I'm just going to pull up my console here and just point out these options. Oh, it went away. Point out these options that I have as part of this. So if I go here and take a look at my vaults, and I'll grab my vault, I'll say backup. I'll use the backup tool that's part of this. And when I do, I'll say I'm doing a backup, I have the option to back up the databases only. Now I get this is the thing I thought was strange. I get this notification that says, hey, this can cause an incomplete backup with no physical files. Well, that sounds terrible, right? So it's like, well, I don't want to do that. So without understanding the workflow I'm about to show here, you might say, what? That doesn't make any sense. Same thing on restore. If I'm restoring, I can say, I want to use an existing file store, and it says, you have to copy the files to the destination folder. So there's options here, but it's not clear why they're here, right? This is actually something that Imaginet has been doing for a while now, using SQL backups of databases, kind of using a few tricks here and there. Now it's built into the software. So I feel comfortable sharing this secret or this method because we kind of made it up. I'm sure some other people have used it as well, but it's the idea of decoupling these. So talk about copying the file store. How do you copy the file store? There's a tool called Robocopy. If you have not used it, it's a fantastic tool. It runs from the command line. And basically I can say we're going to copy, there's 3 switches that we can run this with. I'm going to copy from a particular source to a particular destination and /mir. It mirrors the directory tree. This will skip any files that already exist, and it will copy over any files that have changed or any new files. But if it's the same file, it just skips right on by it. That's really useful because you can copy once and then copy again to catch any changes there are between your 2 file stores that you're copying from. So this is always my warning that I give as I get into this particular workflow. I absolutely loved this quote, and this is paraphrased. It was dragons the first time, but I'm dealing with giants. So this is the workflow I'm going to suggest. If you want to try this, always test this process. This is very specific. You want to do it on a test server before moving to production. This allows you to prove out the workflow, make sure it works the way you're expecting it to work, and it gives you an understanding of how long that process is going to take. So both of those things are very important because now if we have a go live date where we're going to move to a new version of something, we want to be able to have access to all the information so that we can bring it all across at the same time and everything comes across at once. That's what we want to have in place. Right? So it's very important. So let's talk about the process. It kind of looks like this. First, we would robocopy the file store from server A to server B. Users can still use the vault. They can still access it. They can do that. I don't care if this takes 3 days, right, to copy that over. They can still continue to use the vault. So effectively, what this lets us do is pre-stage the new server. We have the files copied over so that the new server can access them. Once we have that, we would then back up the databases. Now, this is kind of the point of no return. We say, hey guys, Vault's going to be down. We're going to take we're going to back up the databases, copy them over to the new server, and then we robocopy again. This lets us pick up any new files or any files that have changed since the last time. This is typically a very quick process, right? Because we might have had 2 terabytes of data we copied initially, but in the last 3 days, 70 files have been changed, 100, 10 new ones have been added. So that should copy very quickly. Now we've got a up-to-date file store. We've got the databases we took as the backup so that when we restore, we can restore it into the new environment and we can say use the existing file stores. We can point to that file store that we copied over. This method generally will get you a long way, and we use it. We've used it fairly commonly, right? For very large databases, this is a great way to use it. The fact that it's built into, we were using kind of some back-end methods and creating an empty file store to copy from, and it worked. There were some ways we could do that, but the fact that this is built into 2024 makes life a lot easier. So what we wanted to talk about, the idea of the best practices of purging the vaults, the difference between backing up just the databases. Those databases are always so much smaller than the file store, sometimes 10% of the file store, maybe less. So it makes it a lot easier to back up just the databases. And then different ways of copying the file store. I've got Robocopy is probably one of the most common tools that we use for that and being able to go through that and move that between those. Okay, so a couple ideas here as we kind of wrap this up and take a look at asking some questions and going through that. Taking a look at the final thoughts. Which one of these should you use? A little bit of each, right? You know, it's what my grandpa always said when presented with more than one kind of pie. A little bit of each. You would have the ability to say, well, I want to, maybe right now we leave it alone, right? We don't have to do too much. It's not dramatic that we don't have to make a change. That's always something to consider. You don't have to, just because it's capable, you don't have to. Once you have that, though, you say, well, maybe I do want to do something. I honestly look at those purging options and the way that you can go in and purge those to make that smaller. Then, of course, you're eventually going to have to upgrade these things. So that's where the new tools come in so that we can pull all of those together. So that's what I wanted to go through today and kind of talk through those pieces, being able to talk through the idea of purging the vaults, backing up just the databases, different ways to copy the file store, wrestling that growth giant to the ground so that you can sleep easy at night knowing you're well defended.